years or so. And it's already been applied in a lot of ways to how we think about complex economic systems, but there's still a great deal of gains to be had by continued work in that area. Our next speaker, Matt Jackson from Stanford and SFI, I think is really working at the forefront of that area, and I'm happy to turn it over to him for a talk on formal markets and informal networks. Matt?
Thanks. So thank you very much for having me. I'll make sure this mic is on, the roaming mic. So I think, as was just mentioned, the set of application areas in economics where we're aware that lots of structure and the shape of interactions makes a big difference has grown quite exponentially in the last 2 decades. And in particular, there's lots of examples now where we really have gone beyond sort of formal anonymous markets to think about how the shape of the relationships actually impacts the outcomes. And this is a very partial list, but I think you're seeing sort of this perspective permeate economics these days. And in particular, I'll talk a little bit tomorrow about finance and how we understand how financial systems now are making the world better off, but also putting it at greater risk, and trying to understand how, I think in terms of framing this talk, systems are often built for one purpose, but they serve multiple purposes. And in particular, when we think about our networks, our friendships, our colleagues, they're shaped for certain purposes, but they end up having impacts in other areas. And one example is labor and labor markets. We get our jobs through referrals, but we don't form those friendships often for referrals. We have, even networks like LinkedIn serve lots of purposes beyond just getting people referrals to jobs. And that understanding how these systems interact is very important. And I think in terms of understanding complex systems from SFI's perspective, often we think of a particular system at a time. And what I want to point out here is that these systems interact in fairly complex ways, and they interact in ways that can be unexpected. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a bit about some projects that I've undertaken with Abhijit Banerjee, Arun Chandrasekhar, and Esther Duflo. And I'll give you 2 snapshots of this project. And this is actually timely. Abhijit and Esther won the Nobel Prize about 3 weeks ago in economics. So they've been recognized for sort of doing development economics writ large. This project started out as a fairly specific question that we were interested in trying to understand how people get information about formal market opportunities. And what it ended up being was more than that. And I'll sort of explain to you the starting point and then the end point of the project. And in particular, there's sort of 2 main points that we'll go through. One is how informal networks make a difference in spreading information about formal market opportunities. And in this particular case, what we were interested in was spreading microfinance loans among a population of poor people in rural India. So we were trying to get information about these kinds of programs out to people, and it turns out that the informal networks were the ways to get people informed. And so those networks were important in making sure that that market could work. The second part is actually once the loans were undertaken and people started getting microfinance, it turned out to change their social network structure. So there was a feedback effect in the fact that now they had money, that changed the way they interacted with each other and actually changed the nature of those interactions. And so the first part of the project was just figuring out how the networks help the markets, and then the second part of the project turns out to be how did the networks actually change in response to those markets. So the markets made a difference eventually. And so I'll just go through this project. It's just sort of a microcosm of one of these applications. So the empirical background was, we partnered with a bank called BSS. They were interested in figuring out how they could get better participation in their microfinance loan programs. These are Grameen-style loans. So Grameen-style loan means these are loans given to women aged 18 to 50 years old. Their loans, they were on the order of roughly $200 for a year, 50-week period, about a 30% interest rate. And the idea here was they were going in and offering these loans, non-collateralized loans, and in some villages they'd get very high take-up, in other villages they'd get no take-up. And they were trying to figure out how could they better spread news about this. And they're doing it by word of mouth. So the data are that there were 75 villages that they were planning on entering. And eventually, in terms of the study, to try and understand how networks were changed, It turns out that the bank entered 43 of these villages. So we went out before the bank entered the villages, mapped out all the networks. They came into the villages, started offering microfinance, and sort of we traced out how information about microfinance spread and how the take-up of these loans spread. Serendipitously, what happened in 2009 and 10 was after the financial crisis, the bank pulled back on their loan program and stopped lending. And so they'd entered 43 of the villages but hadn't entered the other 32. And so then afterwards, we went back into the villages and we could see how the villages that got the loans differed from the villages that didn't get the loans. So we can do a comparison between these villages that got loans and the ones that didn't and see how the network structures changed in response to that. Okay, so all of this took place in rural Karnataka, so this is more or less in about a 100-kilometer band around Bangalore. This is a typical village. They're fairly poor villages, about $1 to $3 per capita income per day. Various agricultural things that they're involved in for their productivity. I don't know if you've been following the air quality in Delhi, but this is sort of a picture, a typical December picture. They burn pretty much whatever they can get their hands on for warmth. So here you see cow pies on the roofs. So the air quality tends to be pretty heavy. But these are fairly poor villages. The people don't have access to formal loans. And then this was a program where the bank was coming in and offering these loans. So what we did was we went into a village. We would go in, map out the social networks in those villages. So this is a typical village. And each one of those little teeny dots is an adult. And then they're grouped into households. So the households often have several generations of adults in them. And then we ask them a series of questions. So we have 12 different networks for each village. And one of the questions we asked them was, if you needed to borrow 50 rupees for a day, who would you go to? So 50 rupees is about $1. So it's about a day's wage. So then there's an arrow pointing to somebody else if that person pointed to that other person. So from that, we can start to build a network. And so we have borrowing, we have who do you go to temple with, who do you go to for important advice, who comes to you to borrow kerosene and rice. So kerosene is used for heating and cooking. Who do you go to in an emergency for medical help? So there's a series of different relationships. And from this, we can see which households interact with which other households. Okay? So there's a structure there. You can begin to look at these. Now this is a different way of picturing the same networks. This is one of the villages. This is village 26, and this is the kerosene and rice network. So I think of the kerosene and rice as sort of the backbone networks in these villages. This is one of the most heavily transacted networks. And in particular, this one now is colored by caste. So each one of the little dots is now a household. And there's a link between two households if they borrowed kerosene or rice from each other. And the blues are what are known as scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. So these are the ones that are relatively disadvantaged and considered for affirmative action by the Indian government. Whereas the reds are the general, the sort of forward castes and then the otherwise backward castes, so the relatively advantaged castes. And you can begin to see, this is just drawn by a standard Spring algorithm that tries to pull nodes together if they're connected and pushes them apart if they're not. So it uncovers this idea that there's segregation in these villages, heavy segregation by caste, which shouldn't be surprising. But that means if information goes into one part of the network, it doesn't necessarily spread to another part of the network. So these networks are highly insular, and trying to get information out in the networks can depend heavily on this kind of structure. Okay, so the first thing we asked, so the bank's strategy in going into these villages was to basically look for well-connected people. So their idea was, we want to get the news out. We've got to find the best connected people in the village, tell them that we're coming in to offer our loans, tell them to spread the news, and then we'll see what happens. And so they went in and they looked for shopkeepers, self-help group leaders, and teachers. So those were the categories of people that they thought would be well-connected. And so sometimes those people might turn out to be somewhere on the periphery, other times they might turn out to be fairly central. And so one hypothesis is if they hit the highly central people, then they're going to get a lot of spread of information, they're going to get good take-up and participation in microfinance, and other times they won't. So that was one of the hypotheses that we're investigating. Okay, there's a long history of trying to understand, what's the right way of measuring who's influential and who's good for spreading information, who sort of the powerful nodes are. And I'll spend a little time on that. And this goes back to Simmel in the 1900s. but there's sort of a long history of this, of trying to identify who are the most influential nodes in a network. And I'll just take you a few ideas behind this to try and understand what actually happened in these villages. So the most basic thing is just a popularity measure, right? So usually when we think of influence, we think of who has the most followers on Twitter, or who has the most friends in Facebook, or so there's just some measure of just raw numbers. And this is known usually as degree centrality. So a degree of a person is just how many connections they have. And so here, if you're looking at these two networks, these two nodes that have the most connections would seem to be the places you'd want to inject information if you wanted it to spread it in those networks. Okay, that's great. So what's wrong with degree centrality? Degree centrality does not take into account broader position in the network and how well connected your friends are. So, for instance, these two twos both have two friends, but it's clear that this one is connected to a 7 and a 6, this one being connected to two twos. There's a sense in which the one with the friends with 7 and 6 is better connected. It's also more centrally connected somehow in this picture. So we want some notion that captures the idea that people are not only have certain numbers of connections, but have well-connected friends. Okay. So the way that people usually deal with this is something that's known as eigenvector centrality. And the concept is actually quite simple, and it works out nicely mathematically. So the idea is that my centrality is not proportional to how many friends I have, but is proportional to the total centrality of my friends. So if I have more central friends, that's better. Having a lot of friends can be good, but it's the total centrality of my friends that matters. So my centrality should just be proportional to the sum of my friends' centrality. Okay? So now we just have a system of equations and unknowns. This is just a simple calculation in linear algebra. It's an eigenvector calculation. It turns out that there's nice mathematics behind this. Frobenius theorem tells us there's a single solution to this that has all non-negative entries. So there's a nice solution to this, and you can calculate it. And in particular, if you go back to this particular network, what do you see? This one comes out at 0.31. This one comes out at 0.11. So this one is sort of 3 times more central, according to this idea that it's your friends who matter, not just how many friends you have. Okay? And then you can see this one's almost as important as the one that has 7, and the most important node now is this one, the 0.5 there. So this is picking out different nodes, and this is actually closely related to sort of page rank and other notions that were important in Google as a search engine and other things. So this kind of idea gets more, if we think about information spreading, it's keeping track of how well connected my friends are. That might be a better measure than just counting friends. Okay. What we thought about was neither of these are actually designed for understanding information spread. So if we want to understand information spreads in a way that has 2 different features. One is it's somewhat probabilistic, and secondly, it has a finite time horizon. People get tired of it after a while, it decays, and it stops spreading after some time. So if you look at the half-life of tweets or other things, sometimes they'll be as short as 18 hours, sometimes 24 hours. There might be a period with which things spread, and then it's old news and it just dies out. And so what we added was sort of a simple measure that has 2 dimensions to it. And this we call diffusion centrality. And so the idea behind this is I look at a particular person. Let's just take a picture. I look at somebody, and maybe this is the teacher in the village. I tell the teacher that we're going to come and have spread news about loans. And then this person can spread information, and they spread it randomly. So they randomly bump into some friends, and here the probability is 0.5. That means that any particular friend they're going to bump into with a chance 0.5 in any given period. So the next day, maybe they bump into half their friends, and they tell them about this project. And then t equals 4 means that this is going to happen for 4 iterations, and after that, this process just stops. So we go through, and if we just do a simulation on this, we could go through with this. The first node told somebody, second day they tell somebody else. It's sort of spreading outwards. We go through, we run a simulation with these parameters. We get a 13 for this node. So that gives us some idea of if this was a random process that had some finite time to it, how far would it spread? And then it dies. Okay, if you start with another node, you go through this, and you run it a series of times, you get a 6. Okay. Now you can do this for different nodes. You can do it. There's ways of approximating this calculation and getting a nice calculation from it. What's nice about this measure is it actually nests the other 2 that we talked about earlier. So when we think about this degree centrality, if I just did this once, right? So if I had people spread news once and then it died after one period, it would only reach my immediate friends. And so it would just be, if I had twice as many friends as you did, then I would get twice as many people on average. So this would be degree centrality. If you run this for t equals infinity, then it just keeps echoing around the whole system and goes forever. And that turns out to be the calculation behind eigenvector centrality. So you can prove a theorem that if this just happens once, it's degree centrality. If it happens many times and p is at least 1 over the first eigenvalue, then this thing converges to eigenvector centrality. So what we're interested in is communication often happens somewhere in between. It's not totally viral, it keeps going forever, and it's not as if it just goes distance one and then people never resend things. And so if you go through that, and now if we look at the different villages and try to predict what % of microfinance participation was there, how much can we explain out of the overall microfinance participation across these different villages? If we just use village characteristics, how big was the village, how many castes did it have, and so forth, you can explain about 25% of what happened. If you add degree centrality, you get it up a little above 30. If you use eigenvector centrality, it's slightly more, but not significantly more. And if you use this diffusion centrality, you can get it up to 47%. That's using a crude version of diffusion centrality. If you actually fit it to the data where you try and estimate that p and the t, it turns out that p in our data is about 0.2. People talk to about 1/5 of their friends in a given time period, and t looks like a 3. It goes out about distance 3 and then just dies. And if you use that, then you can get this up to about 63%. So it goes even higher if you use that. Okay, so what does this tell us? In that paper, which incidentally was rejected by an economics journal, so we eventually published it in Science. That's not something that's unique to non-economists by any means. So in any case, what do we take away from this? The informal network was important in sort of getting the information out and making sure that things got out in terms of hitting the right nodes was important, but hitting the right nodes in a very specific sense. So understanding the particular complex system that's at work here in terms of how information spreads gives us an idea of who is important in these villages, and using the wrong measures doesn't do very well. So you don't explain much at all if you've got a sort of off-the-shelf centrality measure as opposed to one that actually tries to model the specific process that's actually going on among these people in this particular instance. Okay, so that was the first part of the project, and let me just say a little bit about what happened serendipitously of this. And this goes back again, and we've got a Ken Arrow quote here. So this leads to an important long-standing question: does the market, for that matter, large, efficient, bureaucratic state, destroy social links that have positive implications for efficiency? So if you've read Putnam or if you've looked at other, you've seen some complaints, Bourdieu, about the erosion of social capital once we get into large market systems. And here we actually had a system by which we had a sort of a serendipitous experiment where we could really see whether that was true. And in particular, so 2006, we surveyed the 75 villages. 2007 till 10, they entered 43 villages, offered loans. They didn't go into the other ones. And in 2011 and 12, we resurveyed all the villages. So then we're able to compare the villages that got loans to the ones that didn't. Okay? Now this is not a controlled experiment, so we can't do causal inference because they entered 43 villages without randomly picking those 43 villages. So since then, we've also done another study where we went to another 102 villages, and we randomly picked the villages that a bank went into and then held a set constant, and we get more or less the same numbers. But I'll show you the non-randomized version because we have better data here. Okay, so what actually happened here? So first of all, let's just look at the density of the networks in these places. So how many connections do typical families have? And so here, if we look at the non-microfinance villages, we can look at how many links, what's the fraction of the rest of the population of families that a given family is connected to. So a little less than 10% of the families. Afterwards, it was a little more than 8%. Okay, so there was a drop in those villages, but the drop we saw in the microfinance villages was about twice as much. So we saw about a 2 times larger drop in the number of connections in the villages that actually got loans. And so one story for this is, well, people get loans, and now they don't need to borrow from their friends, and so that particular kind of borrowing and lending relationship starts to disappear. And the question is, what does that disappear more broadly? Are there other networks being affected? So we would expect the borrowing and lending relationships to disappear, and indeed they do among the people that got microfinance. What we did was we looked at not only the borrowing and lending relationships, we also broke them down by different types of families. So there's certain families who are the families who are likely to take out loans. We call those high propensity, so we did propensity scoring here to bin these different families. So there's some families that are highly likely to get microfinance loans. There's others that are less likely. The highly likely tend to be more educated, a little wealthier, a little older, a little larger, more central. So there's certain aspects about predicts whether a family is going to get microfinance. And so we can compare those in the microfinance villages to the non-microfinance villages, and then the people who never would have gotten loans to the ones from the control group as well. And so here what's actually happening is it's not just the high types, the people who are very likely to get microfinance that are losing these relationships. In fact, the lows are losing relationships at even a faster rate. And moreover, the lows lose relationships not just to highs, but to other lows. And then when you add in the advice network drop looks almost exactly like the borrowing and lending network. And in particular, what's happening here is that a lot of their relationships are what are called multiplexed by sociologists. They're layered on top of each other. So the people I borrow and lend with are also the people I get help from, I get my kerosene and rice from, I get my advice from. If we kill that borrowing and lending relationship, we kill a whole series of other relationships. And we're seeing it erode not only among the highs, but also among the lows in this population. Okay. So, what are the kinds of lessons we learned from this particular empirical investigation? One is that there's complementarities and spillovers. So the microfinance participation behaviors affects others, and it affects others, even the people that they're not directly related to. So when we look at these networks, there can be families that are completely isolated from the microfinance people, and they're losing relationships as well. And we go through sort of modeling and trying to understand exactly what's happening here. And the story that seems consistent with what the people tell us from the villages is that effectively, once they sort of hang out in a town square, they go to tea together, there's certain kinds of things that they do together, and when the highs get the loans, they stop doing as much of that. And that sort of erodes that particular interaction, and then the lows stop going there, and then the whole thing spirals downward. And so the town squares and the microfinance villages are just less active and less interactive places than the ones in the non-microfinance villages. Okay, so some are implications. The exposure to these formal loans is changing social fabric. That's having unintended consequences. The lows are losing relationships, and it could increase inequality. We see it in terms of the networks. We see an increase in the network inequality. We don't have measures here of the financial inequality. So we were actually connecting that in some of the other data where we can do a better job of actually seeing whether this has also financial consequences. But it certainly doesn't mean that we shouldn't be offering loans. It just means that when we look at any kind of economic system, those economic systems interact with social systems. And the social systems are important in making the economic systems function, and the economic systems actually affect the social system structures as well. And so I think that that's sort of the message that we pull out of this, is that these things interact in conjunction, they're intertwined, and when we design policies in one sphere, we should have a good idea of what the implications might be in another sphere. And if we're going to be modeling and researchers and scientists, we have to think of these things holistically because they're very closely related to each other and they make a big difference. So let's see, I guess, yeah. You can read more about this I have a recent book and then a sort of an older book that's more technical in nature. But thank you very much.
Matthew, thanks so much. Isn't what you're seeing in these villages happening just globalization on a very small scale? In other words, the people who are getting the loans, aren't they likely establishing new relationships with people outside of their villages or whoever their customers are, et cetera, that might not be captured by your networks?
Yeah, certainly. So I think there's two aspects. One is, part of the fact that even in the control villages, we're seeing some erosion in the basic social structure is due to the fact that in this area, people are getting jobs in Bangalore and in other places and moving more of their life starts to go outside the villages. And we might expect that for the highs, the people who are high, the people who actually got loans. The fact that the lows are losing more of these relationships, and these are the people who aren't getting actual access to the credit and not moving out, they're less likely to be moving outside the villages. So I think there's sort of a complex interaction which says that one part of your social society structure works depends on the other part. And as we change the highs, and it could be that they're forming additional relationships outside the villages, then that's impacting the lows as well. So it's yes, I mean, certainly, and I think on a global scale, I wouldn't want to extrapolate too much from this. It's certainly not a message at all that markets are a bad thing and so forth. It's just that they have impacts and they operate in conjunction with these other systems.
Monica Capra. As related to the previous question, so do you have a sense whether the villagers felt that they were worse off? Do you have a measure of well-being, for example? And you could imagine that even if you are a low type, that perhaps you don't want dependence on the mean cousin, who can actually, come back and hit you if you don't, give something back that you owed. So in a way, it could be actually, even though the social fabric is being eroded, it could be that it's for the benefit of everyone, although you need more time to see it.
Yeah, I think in long terms, we can't be saying too much, and we don't have really good welfare measures. We have tracked the borrowing and lending of the lows as well, and what does happen is the lows tend to substitute the types of loans that they would have gotten from friends and family and acquaintances, and instead they're going to money lenders. The interest rates in these villages for money lenders tend to be about 50 to 55%. The interest rates from the bank were between 30 and 40%. The interest rates among friend and family tend to be between 0 and 20%, depending on the circumstances. But so there's very different interest rates, and it does appear, at least crudely, they're moving away from the social structure, and you're seeing that loans go up in terms of the money lenders instead. So there is some substitution that they're doing, but we don't have consumption data in these households and so forth. I think the main message is just we see changes, and it just means that we should be more aware of these interacting systems, but we don't have a good welfare measure for that at this point.
Hi, Matt. Fantastic talk, as your talks tend to be. A question, I'd like to focus on what you said at the end right then, and also at the very end of your talk, which can be summarized as beware unforeseen side effects. That's almost by definition something you can't really do if they're no, I'm not being glib. And this is not a criticism, it's opening up. There's a similar issue that actually the SFI has been trying to grapple with for a long time, and how do you model innovation that's truly innovative where you don't build it into the model from the first place? Do you have any kinds of insights, especially if we start to explode these kinds of issues up to the kinds of things that Eric was talking about, where you're talking about planet-wide kinds of things? Go back to the great debacle that sullied the reputation of neoliberal economics, 2007. Right. That was unforeseen. Lots and lots of Monday morning quarterbacking where we can look back and see all the signals, but at the time that was unforeseen. Yeah. Certainly when you're talking about things like climate change, the error bars go through the roof, and those are only concerning the things that we even know to measure. So do you have any insights into how to get our hands around this kind of an issue?
No, I mean, I think I don't have a simple recipe. I think the one thing that we underestimate often, and this has come up already in some of the discussion, is the interaction between various types of systems. And here we're looking at sort of informal social systems and more formal market transactions where you're dealing with a bank, but you're also dealing with villagers. And that can be true whether we think about the interaction between a government and markets, or various political entities or organizations. So I think in general, it just says that anytime we're looking at some system, we ought to at least look at the adjacent systems, the ones that we know the participants are also members of. and also interacting in. And that's sort of a minimal starting point. And when you talk about the financial crisis, you know, it's a wonderful system. The financial system was wonderful for moving capital around and getting it to places that never had been before. But at the same time, that movement of capital meant that now defaults could cascade. And so, you know, there's all these unintended consequences. And I don't have a simple recipe for anticipating these things other than to realize that anytime we're looking at a system, we shouldn't just do sensitivity analysis within that system. We should do it across systems as well.
Hi, Tim Kabarge. You used that algorithm that broke it into blues and reds, and like there's a reality behind that it's like you were in one class versus another class. There's a European the guy who passed away who used to run Fiat, who used to say that it was amazing in America that people would move to places, whereas in Europe people wouldn't move to places, and so it degraded the social contracts that people had with their small communities. But you get all of this, like the room that we're in. So I was wondering, like, is there a way of like measuring whether or not you're going to leave the group? Like in that culture, you're not going to move from red to blue, but in other systems, you will change the group that you're in if there's if the connection between you changes.
Yeah, I think, well, there's a literature that I'm not directly involved in by any means on migration and networks and trying to understand what's push and pull. And so, for instance, if you look at particular countries, you know, people have looked at Mexico and looked at where do people from Mexico go to, and they tend to go to places where they have friends and family already established and where they can, you know, move into some place where they have those connections. So often, when you're actually looking at migration, it's, you know, it could be that I'm cutting some ties in one place, but often it's being pulled from ties in another place that will determine where I end up. And that's a fairly strong indicator of what my prospects are. So there's really nice studies by Lori Beeman, for instance, who look at, you know, there were people who relocated as refugees, and she looks at how large the community was of the friends and family and acquaintances of the people who were relocated. And when they move into an area where they have an existing network, they had significantly higher employment rates and integration rates than in situations where they were you know, moving into some place where they didn't have any connections. So those kinds of informal social structures are very important, but they tend to be really highly segregated. They tend to fall along all kinds of lines. So here we're seeing it on caste, which is obviously very strong in India. In the US, you see it along ethnic lines, along religious lines, along political lines increasingly, along age lines. So there's, you know, it's pretty hard to find a human network that doesn't split along some kind of divide. And those divides are really important in determining where people end up and where they go.